TNKR Media.
I abhor it, I deplore it, I can't understand it, it breaks my heart. It is anathema to everything I've loved about American values.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
Welcome back to the Goldwaters. I am your moderator, Dan Delmar, and Daniel is with me. How's it going, Daniel? It's a heavy topic.
Yeah, I got Jews on my mind.
What made you want to talk about white supremacy and the JQ?
And the JQ, the big Jewish question, the question for the ages. Well, part of it is I'm Jewish and I'm ethnocentric. The other part of it is that was half joking. The other part of it is that it's something I probably alluded to on prior episodes, but in my undergrad, my history degree, it was really I really devoted my study to ethnic and religious conflict in the modern era, history of anti-Semitism and genocide, all that stuff. So I'm kind of somewhat reared on the topic, and it's something that I'm interested in. And given the current the Trumpocalypse that we're living through, and that things like alt-right and white nationalism are being discussed more and more, I figure there's a hook there. And
you do part ways with your mom on this episode on the question of panic, not feeling a sense of panic at this point.
No, I don't. And I find that when you talk about these topics, like talk about anti-Semitism with a group of Jews, naturally they have a dog in the fight, and people get a little alarmist, I guess as well they should. And I think that while we could talk about how alarming it is to see white nationalists marching in Charlottesville or being active online, there's the other reality, which I still think has to be squared, which is that, again, Donald Trump is, I think, also very close to Jewish Americans, like in many ways. Like there's the first time there's Jewish grandchildren crawling in the White House. Okay, it's just a reality. People have to square that. There's plenty of good counter arguments that it's not relevant, but it is still a basic reality that all his grandchildren are Jewish, and that he's been very close to the Jewish community in New York City, and has been, at least in his rhetoric, extremely pro-Israel, and seems to be close with Netanyahu, closer than the previous administration. And these are not necessarily good or bad things, but these are things. And it's I don't see how people can look at that and say, oh, there's a threat to Jewish Americans, that there's a coming Kristallnacht. I think that's hysterical.
So it's complicated. Let's get to the conversation, and we'll have your further reading selections at the end of the podcast. So Goldwaters, we're on anti-Semitism and white nationalism today, so let's just jump right in. Of course, we're hearing a lot from white nationalists in the past few months that are, in some cases, becoming rather explicit in their demands for a white ethno-state in the United States. Since the election of Donald Trump, of course, they've become a little bit emboldened and risen to greater prominence. So let's get into what motivates these people and begin with really what they want. Are they really advocating for, as they say, an ethno-state and perhaps greater consideration for white Americans, or are they outright fascists and supremacists? What do you make of the last few months in America?
But it seems like, as best as I can decipher, one of the overarching things is wanting to have this country for us as defined by whites who have some history in the United States and are considered, and they consider themselves white.
Yeah, but who are they is more important, I think, in the discussion, because I find there's been this conflation of people that subscribe to, say, Breitbart News, and people who might be card-carrying members of the KKK and are grand cyclopses and wizards and gnomes and hobbitses.
Yeah, it's really weird the overlap between fantasy and like KKK. That's one thing I
always said J.R.R. Tolkien is a secret anti-Semite. I'm telling you, if you read
J.R.R. Tolkien.
Sorry. Well, he was really into analyzing old Teutonic myths, and he had actually gone into, I think, phrenology at the time, which was en vogue. But no, I don't want to cast aspersions. I mean, no, I don't think he's not an anti-Semite. I'm being silly.
Not
It's just
at all. Well, I think that there's something that bothers me about human nature. First of all, I'm always worried about conversations that start with we and they. When you start dividing the world into we and they, you're going down a very, very dangerous path. And there seems to be something intrinsic in human nature to engage in a certain form of tribalism. And I'm reminded of a little anecdote from César Millan, the dog whisperer, who noted that when he would go on his long walks with dogs of all races, creeds, religions, and persuasions, they would sort themselves out by their social class, and the dominant dogs in the front, and the alpha dogs and the beta dogs more in the back.
the white supremacist dogs in the middle.
Right.
The golden retrievers, you can't trust those guys.
Yeah, seriously. And then, dog lives do matter. And then when he would stop in a forest by some shade or at a lake, the dogs then would sort themselves out, interestingly, by breed. And the brown Labradors would hang with the brown Labradors and the Goldens with the Goldens. And there just seemed to be something in mammals about this identification of what your group is. And humans seem to engage in that.
Okay, but these are general social observations. We're very far afield from the white ethno-state and the politics that are dominating the discourse
you're
right
related
now.
to Caesar Milan and
Caesar Milan
dogs
and Haitians
No,
and an
there are
Indian
things-
caste system. Gandhi's going to
I'm
walk
a
in the
blank
door.
slate. No, don't be unfair. I'm a blank slate who never expected these issues to be issues of my generation. I'm the tail end of the 60s generation, where we're all the same and we're all long-haired hippies and we can't tell can't tell the skin color of each other because most of us in that generation were kind of dirty, unwashed.
It was so nice in the 60s when racism didn't exist. That was so great.
There was a pretense of the boomer generation that we were going to eliminate racism. That was the...
Good job, guys. You did it.
We made a very noble effort. Don't be unfair. There's still a huge social leap forward. You can't disregard that. And it seemed to me that the next generation would grow up and not be as racist as the generation before. But the reality is these people from different cultures and communities who are themselves different colors have this kind of tribalism, the us and the they thing.
Yeah, but actually, it's funny you should say that because there's some critiques from the right that say that the problem with the left came after your period was that it started to get mired in identity politics. So there was a time when you had things like egalitarian feminism and the civil rights movement was that there should be equal service and equal rights for all, rather than the notion of empowered ethno communities that should be enforcing their own sort of curriculum, their own sorts of ideas and things that are sort of affirmative action type of policies that protect certain identifiable minority groups.
You're conflating two things. You're conflating affirmative action, with which I have considerable difficulty, with the continuation of tribalism, but on the left. And I agree with you, and I have a certain agreement with the critique that comes from the right about that if there's supposed to be equality and equal treatment, then we're all the same, the sort of we're all Americans ethos that existed as far back as the 50s, right? Without regard for race or creed or color, with this evolution on the left of this terrible identity politics, with this somehow some great social superiority if you're something different from the average white person, you are somehow now culturally superior and entitled to flaunt your own version of tribalism.
Mom, let me ask you a question. Do you think that white nationalism is ascendant right now, as we speak, in the culture? Whether Canadian
What
or
culture?
Western culture, the dominant discourse today that we find ourselves in?
I think there's a tendency to catastrophize this concept of white nationalism. I think it's always been there. I think it was ascendant certainly in the 20th century and was soundly and roundly defeated. I think that Angela Merkel is going to stay in power. I think Emmanuel Macron was elected and not Marianne Le Pen. So I'm not so sure that it's ascendant.
Do you think that Donald Trump is allied with...
I think there was a Brexit vote, which I think has a big ingredient of white nationalism, makes it all the more disappointing because that vote for that side. And then as for Donald Trump has no ethics, no philosophy, no political affiliation, and no morals of any kind. He appeals to the people that he thinks constitute his base and is willing to pay lip service to a certain degree of white populism, white nationalism. Do I think he's really going to white supremacy? I don't think he knows the difference. I don't think he understands the nuance.
I think he would if it was convenient to him. I don't think it's really something that is entirely thought out. I think it's just he has a lot of loyalty to his base, and he views this as his base. And in terms of, to answer your question, Dale, yeah, I do think white nationalism is ascendant at the moment. Do I think it's hard to say. I was going to say, do I think it's a huge problem now? I think it is a huge problem because of what it is, but in terms of numerically, no. I don't. I think it's still mostly fringe. I think the bigger concern is just the number of people that are willing to apologize or to condone or to wiggle around it. And I think that's much more, that's the bigger concern, the thing that personally I find freaks me out. It's not that there's 100 people that show up at, or that a bunch of people show up with tiki torches. It's all the people that come out afterwards to apologize for them or to make excuses for them.
I think Charlottesville, in and of itself, including the tragic death of that young woman, I think that what's more important is this. The Republican Party failed to declare Donald J. Trump unfit for office after the unhinged presser of the Tuesday after the event. Not the first presser on the Saturday, not the second one on the Monday where he was reading from the teleprompt, but the unhinged one on the Tuesday that made it clear to me he's too influenced by Stephen Bannon, he's too influenced by his readings at Breitbart, and probably a little National Enquirer, a little Allo Police, and that level of reading.
He reads?
He reads, hard to say. I think things are read to him.
I think it's much more basic, is that people that, he knows that these people like him and that have supported him. And to me, it's a very simple thing. It's like, okay, well, you voted for me, and so I'll be nice to you.
That presser on the Tuesday was somebody speaking to him and trying to point out a moral equivalency between the protesters and the counter-protesters, where there was none.
But
and if you're the president of the, let me finish it up, the president of the United States can craft a moral equivalency between those people with the tiki torches, and let's view them as fringe because they are, and the people who were counter-protesting, even if they counter-protested with outrage. When he saw a moral equivalency, this person who has his own clear mental disorders and personality defects, and the grand old party, a party I used to respect, was incapable and remains incapable of saying, okay, we're done. It's now time to say he is not fit for office. Not if he is incapable of leading the country with moral clarity.
The reason I think that Trump is aligned to white nationalists, I don't think it has anything to do with his philosophy or anything like that, if you can even call it a philosophy. It's just that he feels that these guys support him, and that's it. And one thing he's been very, very clear about is that loyalty, whatever loyalty is extremely important to him. And I think that's the reason that he's creating these false equivalencies between protesters and counter-protesters, and between Antifa and, neo-Nazis. It's just that, as well, the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists, the white nationalists, they're the ones who supported me in elections. And they're walking around with signs saying that they're happy that I'm in power, so I'm not going to crap on them. And I think it's really as simple as that. It's just, well, they gave me a cookie and I like cookies, so I'll be nice to them.
I agree with you in your assessment of Trump just being loyal to whoever's loyal to him, and that's just the way he operates. He's very primitive that way. I don't think he's an ideologue. I have to say, though, I know this is unpopular, but I don't actually regard Stephen Bannon as a white nationalist. I mean, I do, from my reading of his oeuvre, what he's put out there, I really do believe he's much more of what he calls an economic nationalist, that he's much more interested in trying to...
Come on.
No, I truly believe that. I don't think that he's ever said or done anything that can be really truly regarded as racist. The only things that were ever taken, that the press really made a big issue about, was in his divorce proceedings. He had mentioned that he was upset about the choice of school for their child because he found that there were too many Jews at this school, and he found that they were arrogant. And I have to tell you, as something that's being said, I mean, look, that's something that can be said by other Jews, like in their own communities, not wanting their kids to go to elite private schools and to be around a certain type of elitism. I don't see that on its own.
I don't think that we equate that specifically to fellow members of our community. When the parents who are anti-elitist will say that they don't want their children to go to school with the rich kids, and they develop these shallow values, which is a legitimate parental opinion. But once you're tying it to a community, you're engaging in a very pernicious form of discrimination. I don't have to tell you, we live in a city with a considerable Jewish population. There are plenty of poor Jews in this city, right? And the elite schools here are not peopled principally
I
by
have
Jewish kids.
friends who have told me they don't want their kids going to a Jewish school because they don't want them to be cut off from the rest of rest of secular community, and they don't want them to feel that sense of Jewish elitism. These are intercultural debates. I understand that.
But at that point, you're just juxtaposing religious Jewish schools versus secular schools that will have Jews in them. Going back to Stephen Bannon, the guy is even more of a flake than you can imagine, because I was reading some background material on him, and he admits to having had a 10 or 12 or 15-year period where he was reading books on religion in his spiritual searching and seeking.
Into mysticism.
And
religious
he's into
mysticism.
Exactly. And a lot of his quotes, white nationalism, is a search for spiritual identity, and his feelings are anathema to the modern secular state, to the values of the Enlightenment. Were you with me there when Ayaan Hirsi Ali was speaking to the New York Public Library a number of years ago? We went with Omar, and Salman Rushdie was there, which was such a thrill. And she said the problem with these religious proselytizers, and I would extend what she said to include Mr. Bannon and crew, is that these people who eschew the values of the Enlightenment and look to religious fulfillment are, at the end of the day, negating love and respect for the individual. They are not promoting a philosophy of the primacy of the individual, which underlines the values of the capitalist secular state, and therefore, to me, are anathema to the true conservative movement that I'd like to think I quite enjoy.
That's an extremely broad critique. Okay, to say that
I
anyone
am
who is
trying to be
allied
give a broad-
with religious mysticism is against the Enlightenment and therefore a racist.
And certainly makes him anti-Semitic. There's not a shadow of a doubt. Is the White House infected with white supremacist thoughts? Absolutely. If there's one thing that's clear about Donald Trump, if we set aside his mental disorders and his absence of adherence to any rational philosophical thought, this is a man who dreams of restoring an era of American supremacy in the world at a time where the fabric of American culture was a whole lot whiter than it is today. What he rejects is not necessarily the lack of spirituality today, because he's certainly not a religious man. He rejects the multicolored, multilinguistic, polyglot society that America is. That's not what he wants. He dreams of the era of Opie, and where everybody was white and Christian, and you didn't have to worry about having a Christmas tree in the town square because there were no Jews and Muslims to accommodate.
I think that no, I don't see it as. I think it's overstated. I think that with Donald Trump, the Trump administration being tough on crime is something that's nothing new to the Republican Party. It's something that's a very standard conservative mentality to increase police powers and to be a bit more difficult with on suspected criminals, and when it comes to things like racial profiling. There's nothing new about Donald Trump on that front with respect to conservatives in America. And when it comes to the real tide change, I would say, is a much more vociferous anti-Muslim rhetoric. I think that there is a sort of clash of civilizations element that is being really encouraged in a way that I don't even think you saw under Bush. I think that he really wants to. The whole idea with the Muslim ban and all the rhetoric about killing the families of terrorists, and he really wants to have this real confrontation with Islam. And in terms of the immigration debate, I think this is a long-standing debate, and I think it's something that the base has wanted for a good long time, and I think that he's been expressing it. But there is an objective problem, and I think that, yes, he's made alliance with white nationalists, but I don't think he has an explicit white nationalist ideology that's animating it.
Personally, I think that where I agree with you, Daniels, I think a lot of the policies that he's advocating are just more of the same in terms of what Republicans have advocated. And there is an overlap in terms of white nationalist philosophy, but it's still something that's not necessarily new to the Trump administration. I think where it does get new is I don't think he has that Trump has an ideology per se. I don't think he is a white nationalist. I don't think he's a fascist. I don't think he's anything. I think he's self-interested. He's interested in himself. I think it's much more simple and calculating. Then you just saw that, okay, well, this is what my base wants. This is what people are going to vote for. So people are really afraid of Muslims right now and want Muslims out. Okay, great. Oh, I get the most cheers at at gatherings when I say build a wall and have Mexico pay for it. Okay, great. So I'll say more than that. And in terms of his support of white nationalists, white nationalist protesters and violent white nationalists, rather than the ones who just espouse violence, is much more basic. Is that the white nationalists themselves say that they're happy Trump is in power, that they support him, and will continue to support him. And so for him, it's a very, very basic loyalty thing. They gave me a cookie. I like cookies. I will support them.
I agree with that, but calling these white nationalist policies, I find, makes it seem as though there's no merits to these policy issues.
I don't think that all the policies are motivated by white nationalism. I think that a lot of them serve white nationalism or in effect advance white nationalism. Do I think that some of the policies that have been in place by Republicans for many years, like stop and frisk, that these are explicitly white nationalist policies? Not necessarily, but are they problematic and do they advance this cause? Absolutely. Honestly, when I first heard the chant, Jews will not replace us, honestly, I was just really confused. I didn't really understand. I was like, where did the Jews come into this? We're talking about Robert E. Lee, we're talking about Confederacy, we're talking about slavery. This is a black-white American history thing. What do we have to do with this? And then for me, it went even beyond that. Jews will not replace us. We're such a small proportion of the population. How do they think we're going to replace them? We're going to replace them in numbers? We're going to take their jobs? I'm so confused. I remember actually, Daniel, coming to you and talking to you about this and just musing about it and just being completely flabbergasted with it. And as we were talking, only sort of, reading some more articles, did start to make a bit more sense. But maybe, Daniel, you want to take the lead here.
Well, I've long been fascinated by extreme hate groups and anti-Semitism. I did my undergrad on the history. Well, my big research report was on the history of anti-Semitism, and even in high school, I actually used to go on the KKK's website and Stormfront, and I used to write some articles for it for class. I was always very curious what these guys think and how they end up there. But to me, it was very clear when they were talking about Jews will not replace us. It's in their perspective. Jews control the media, they control the cultural narratives, and it's a liberal narrative that seeks to displace displace white ethnic groups. They see that the civil rights movement was something that was engineered by Jewish lawyers and Jewish civil rights activists, and that liberal Hollywood is also controlled by Jews, and that they put out these ideas into American culture, and that it's really a way to dilute the nativist interests. And so when they say Jews will not replace us, it's that our narratives are not being told because the Jews are controlling news media and film and press. And it's always much more sympathetic to minority rights because Jews see themselves as minorities. So anytime you empower minority interests, you're really empowering a Jewish perspective, and they have no sense of allegiance to a state because they're essentially a stateless globalist people.
What I find fascinating about that analysis, Daniel, is you were always a person who eschewed Jewish religious observance and going to Jewish school or having Jewish classes. You thought of yourself more, as I would have thought the entire new generation would feel, as sort of a citizen of the world. And yet you came to recognize quite young as a result of your studies that no matter what you think, you will be labeled by these other people as a Jew. And once you're labeled as a Jew, it comes this entire baggage of hatred and rejection. And there's no question, certainly in the United States, that there's this tremendous disconnect between the cultural narrative and governance. Governance is absolutely securely in control of people who are living in 1952 in their minds. The Republican Party, and I would say rather reactionary Republicans at that, because it's Congress, it's Senate, it's state governors, and all levels of governance. And yet the cultural narrative is absolutely liberal and quite tied in with your average North American Ashkenazi Jew's perspective of the world. tolerant, inclusive, respectful of the rights of minorities, people of color, of gays, of the transgendered, and so on. That's very much our cultural narrative, and it's one that is associated with us, which you would think would be a huge compliment, and yet makes us targets for hatred by the people who don't feel like that. And I'm glad you even called them extreme hate groups. I'm quoting you. But there's more than just what the people said in Charlottesville about the Jews will not replace us. They also said they will not replace us, or you will not replace us, referring to black people. And they also were chanting blood and soil, which is an English translation of Blut und Boden, which is blood and soil, blood and mud. From the German, which is what the Nazis chanted. And we are so far removed in terms of a historical issue from whether symbols of the Confederacy merit being in the public place or not. And you see from the cultural narrative, even the great-great-grandchildren of Robert E. Lee believe for the sake of social cohesion, it's time for these statues to come down. And they certainly have a voice and something to say. But they represent cultural values of today where you don't want to commemorate somebody who is associated with fighting against the organized state in order to preserve slavery. But we have no involvement in this. We weren't involved in the slave trade either in Africa
but I don't think
or
that's-
in the States, nor were we involved in the Civil War. We are not part of this difficult part of the social history of the United States, which, let's remember, a lot of right-wing people say correctly, let us keep in mind that the Americans also, in the historical record, freed their slaves. So there is something good that we sometimes
I think
forget.
you're missing the point when you're getting into the weeds of the historical record. I think when Samantha says, like, I don't understand, we're only like 2% of the population or something, the idea is that these are rootless cosmopolitan people who are concentrated in the zones of influence. You talk about the United
Who,
States.
us?
Well, that's their perspective. You talk about the coasts that dominate. The rest of the United States is flyover country, right? This is something that everyone
complains about. Well,
and
it's a
an expression.
denigrating attitude.
And when you
towards
see where
people-
Jews are
just a sec,
concentrated,
it's a denigrating attitude towards people who live in more rural environments. The United States has as a problem a social divide created by the fact that it continues to have huge populations in rural environments. And the less urban your population, the more likely they're going to adhere to values created by a certain social isolation from people of color and people of different religions and values.
Yeah, but part of
and
it-
that word cosmopolitan, that adjective, is pretty charged, and not only is associated with us, with the Jews, but it's it's a code word, I think, for Jews, but one that's quite denigrating. Cosmopolitan, ergo not traditionalist, not respectful of traditions and the natural supremacy of the white man, which is how these people view it, and is close cousin to the other pejorative term in the States, elitist.
Honestly, one of the things that helped to clarify it for me a bit, or just helped to shape my thinking a little bit, like where do Jews come into this debate at all, and why are we involved in this? Was actually this article by Eric K. Ward, where he was looking at how anti-Semitism animates white nationalism, and it was really something that kind of opened my eyes to things. And his premise, as best as I can, I hope I'm articulating it clearly, is that for white nationalists, if they're going to, the basic premise is that they are the superior race, they should be in power, they should be the ones in control, and yet somehow they're losing jobs and they're being usurped and surpassed by women and by minorities. And the question becomes, for them, if women and minorities are inferior, then how is it that they're gaining power? It just creates this big question. They can't possibly be better than the whites. They can't be getting power through that way. And so the only way that minorities and women could be getting power is because of this invisible kind of blending in powerful kind of demonic force, which would be, hey, that's where we come in, the Jews. So it becomes, because we look white, so we can
pass.
we pass. So we can kind of blend in. You don't necessarily know when we're around, and we somehow in their narrative have all this great power in terms of shaping the public discourse, in terms of shaping media, and in terms of politics, and in terms of money and banks. And so somehow we have some intention that the only way that minorities and women can be taking control is because Jews are empowering them and are behind them, pushing them forward and pushing the white man, the real white man, down.
Is there any merit to that viewpoint? I know it's too dangerous thing to even talk about, but I mean, it's not just white nationalists who see that.
Wait, to the viewpoint of the white nationalists?
No, the
or
viewpoint-
to
the viewpoint that Samantha
of the
just
author
described.
Of
No.
this article, Eric Ward.
No, the viewpoint that Samantha of the white nationalists that Samantha just described, that there are
Oh,
that Jews.
seriously, dude. Do we live in a world now where we have to debate whether up is up?
It's not just
we're
white
now
nationalists.
we're now in control of the
Jay-Z, who
black.
right now is essentially a very mainstream icon in American culture. His most recent song was talking about how Jews own all the real estate in America. Okay, he's like a guy who's feted at the White House by Barack Obama. I have nothing particularly against what he is saying. In fact, that's kind of my point. But that this debate has become so charged that you can't even discuss these things.
For Ashkenazi Jews in particular, there's a history to draw on. And the more that we're seeing the rise of the right, the extreme right, and of nationalism, a lot of those anti-Semitic dog whistles are being blown right now throughout Europe and in North America. And so it's scary. And the question starts becoming, well, how many people, how many cemeteries need to be, or tombstones need to be knocked over, how many threats outside synagogues, or how many synagogues need to be defaced before we flee or before we take it seriously. And honestly, I don't know the answer to that. At this point, do I think it's a significant, am I concerned for my family's safety? Not even remotely. Again, I'm in Montreal, we're in Canada, I'm not in the States, and so maybe there'd be a different concern going on there, but I think it's something that I think it's definitely important to keep our eyes open and keep our ears open and just really listen to what direction things are going. I think that the threat from direct groups is very small, but the fact that there's so many apologists and people that are making excuses for this type of anti-Semitic and racist and white nationalist dialogue, I think is deeply concerning and is something to really watch out for.
You always want to be mindful and vigilant about these things because they're serious issues, but I also agree with you, Samantha. I have really absolutely no concern for my Jewish American brothers and sisters. I also think that the real people are going to bear the brunt of all this. The ones who are really who I do worry for are Muslim Americans and
Hispanics.
And Hispanics. I mean, they're the ones who are really like in the crosshairs in all this. And I really think that again, it's alarming to see a bunch of white nationalists marching in the streets with torches saying Jews will not replace us. But I don't think that the scope of it is very considerable. I think that their bark is a lot worse than their bite. I think this is people who thrive on social media and online, and it's really just a bunch of very highly active accounts that can be, essentially a handful of very loud, virulent people. I don't think that there's any considerable uptick in actual hate crimes against Jews, and I think that while we should be concerned, it's not something that should really take up a lot of conversational airspace. I think a lot of the attention should be really should be pointed towards Muslim Americans and Latinos. There's actual policies in place that are going to be ruining their lives. There's nothing you could say about that for Jews.
And France, last word.
I'm having a heart attack. I've not raised you children right either. Your father and I share what I would have thought would be the average Ashkenazi Jew's hypervigilance to our safety. And I would please encourage you with all my heart never to relax that hypervigilance. And I'm certainly extremely proud of you, Daniel, like to the point it makes me want to cry. And I agree that hypervigilance has to extend to ill treatment of all minorities. And the ill treatment of Latinos and Muslims in the United States is precisely what terrifies me for my fellow Jewish citizens. I abhor it. I deplore it. I can't understand it. It breaks my heart. It is anathema to everything I've loved about American values, this failure to embrace these Latinos who, in fact, are the underpinning of American society because they take the lousiest jobs because they have to send money back home to their impoverished families. The Muslims who are coming, when they come to the States, it's to make common cause with us, not to cause social strife. Many of them are escaping social strife in their countries of origin. Certainly that's been my experience here. And of course the blacks that are in the United States also are having a lot of their history of extreme oppression and of slavery being just, I never attempts understood. To whitewash. I have to admit, I feel like I was raised in a bubble in Montreal. I could never have imagined black people would be facing the fear they're facing today. And we as Jews have a huge duty to help these groups, but we must not be any less vigilant for ourselves. And I would hope, in fact, that Justin Trudeau would provide some relaxation of certain immigration criteria to permit people in the States who are afraid, Muslims, Haitians, the Haitians who are bombarding the CBSA here, our Quebec borders, regular, normal black people, not just Haitian black people, English-speaking black people, undocumented Latinos, and offer them a safe haven here. Canada is a big, empty country, and I believe that the people who have the power and the strength of character to be able to emigrate and to come to a new country, these are the people who made Canada and the United States the awesome countries that our countries are, and we need more. We need more and fresher and more interesting immigrants. And that's what I would hope Justin would do. That's my shout out to him. He has to show that he's a moral person and that he's a man of substance and that he's going to stand up and help these minority groups.
Further reading now, back with Daniel, and how do you think that went? Obviously, a lot of mixed feelings, a lot of mixed levels of concern, I take it?
It's difficult to have a cool conversation on this, a level-headed conversation, and you never want to be the guy to say that that everything is fine when you're talking about issues of racism or racial animus. But it's also good to have a sparring partner with my mom. I mean, she's always up for a fight, and often I try to exaggerate my position for the sake of conflict is the truth.
What is your selection for further reading this time?
The text that comes to mind are the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is an infamous document, a forgery actually of an old play, an old satire of Napoleon in the 1800s, and then the Tsarist, the Okhrana, the secret police in 1903 in Russia, had adapted it to replace the liberals that were being satirized in the original text with Jews, and it's become one of the most popular texts on the planet in terms of anti-Semitic literature. Why am I mentioning it? Because it's just so influential. I think it's been translated into every single language on Earth, and I think Walmart was selling it up until a number of years ago. And I think it gives a lot of insight into anti-Semitic ideology, the ways in which... And in fact, the reason I had that sort of inside baseball intro about its original adaptation being a satire of... Napoleon's liberal policies in France is because you start to already see the overlap between. It's often a critique of a liberalizing world, of rights being given to outsiders, and that this is often what anti-Semites associate Jewish power with, perceived and imagined.
That'll do it for this episode of The Goldwaters. You can listen to past conversations at thegoldwaters.ca and join us on Facebook and Twitter, hashtagging The Goldwaters. We'd like to hear from you directly as well. Drop us an email, talk@thegoldwaters.ca, and tell us what you think about today's show. For The Goldwaters, I am your moderator, Dan Delmar. Until next time.
This has been a production of TNKI Media. Good talk.